1959 Western film starring Richard Widmark, Henry Fonda, and Anthony Quinn, and was directed by Dmytryk. Living in fear of a local rancher and his violent band of cowboys, the Citizens Committee of Warlock decide to hire Clay Blaisdell, a professional gunfighter, as city marshal. Things initially are quite peaceful after Blaisdell and his friend Tom Morgan arrive, but once Johnny Gannon, a former cowboy, is hired as the new county sheriff's deputy, and the rancher and his men decide to fight back, the stage is set for a showdown between the three sides. Warlock falls into the gunfighter or town tamer subgenre of westerns, a subgenre I really enjoy. There are a few westerns from the 50s that would be comparable, such as The Proud Ones with Robert Ryan or Man with the Gun with Robert Mitchum. Man with the Gun, in particular, has several scenes that are very similar to scenes in Warlock, such as the scene of the gunman who is about to be hired laying out his ground rules of how he will operate in the job. And also, a climactic scene where a main character has a breakdown of sorts and ends up burning down a saloon in rage. While we're on comparisons, there are many similarities between this film and Ed Harris' Appaloosa. In particular, the relationship between Blaisdell and Morgan in this film, and Virgil Cole and Everett Hitch in Appaloosa. I would assume Robert B. Parker must have had Warlock in mind to some extent when writing the novel Appaloosa, in a character sense, not so much the plot. But besides all of its film counterparts, the main inspiration this film draws from is the Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday story. There were many scenes and moments in this film that you can draw a direct line to events that happened in Tombstone. The real-life city, not the movie necessarily. But I'll get to that a little later. The main thing that I thought set this film apart from all those others, and most westerns in general, is the fact that we have two main protagonists, each with their own character arcs and on separate journeys that occasionally intersect, and then gradually intersect more and more. I suppose an argument could be made that there are three, with Anthony Quinn's Tom Morgan being the other, but I'm mostly going to focus on Richard Widmark as Johnny Gannon and Henry Fonda as Clay Blaisdell. Gannon is the cowboy or outlaw who has to turn on his friends and go against them to bring law and order. And Blaisdell is the laconic master gunfighter who finds himself torn between a life of violence and a woman he loves. Each of these characters have enough depth and layers to them to easily carry an entire movie by themselves, and many westerns have. But taking these two familiar character types and putting them at odds was what really made this movie stand out for me. And when they're embodied by such skilled actors as Henry Fonda and Richard Widmark, that only elevates it. Richard Widmark was such an interesting character, and almost seemed to me to be playing against type. This might be an odd reason why it felt that way to me, but it came down to his costume first of all. In this film he wears the familiar short denim jacket and narrow-brimmed hat that he's worn in other 50s westerns, like Backlash or The Law and Jake Wade, and that automatically establishes a certain type of character in my mind. That visual just makes me slot him into something that I've seen before. But right from the earliest scenes in the movie, it feels different. You can see he's already on the outskirts of a group of men that he used to call friends. One of them's even his own brother. While they are hoorahing and shooting up the town, he hangs back, unsure what to do. You can tell that he's dealing with some pretty heavy issues that are weighing on his mind. And you see that start to change from a more passive, conflicted observer to trying to keep peace, until finally he takes the job that no one else wants, the low-paid county sheriff's deputy. And then this character becomes something else entirely, almost Will Kane-esque in the situation he finds himself facing. But now, on to Henry Fonda. He brings such a cold, professional demeanor to this role, in certain scenes, that I think you can start to see the makings of his frank character from Once Upon a Time in the West. That's not to say he's a villain, far from it, but you can see the same detached, calculating mindset in both characters. Clay Blaisdell is the stereotypical man with a code, but he's not afraid to kill, and never questions that instinct for a second. Even when he does fall for a local woman and considers giving up the job that he's known for across the West, it's only because he wants to be with her more, not because of any deep-seated guilt or a weariness over the violent lifestyle that he leads. It's in that relationship that we see the other side of Clay Blaisdell, the softer side that leads to the woman, Jessie Marlowe, played by Dolores Michaels, who at first had contempt for him and his occupation, leads her to warm up to him and fall in love with him as well. In the earlier scenes before he gets together with Jessie, Henry Fonda is very enigmatic in the role and does something I thought was a great choice and demonstrates what type of man this is. A couple of different times when someone is talking to him, while they're still talking, he just begins walking away, or looks away, and continues surveying the situation and potential opponents in front of him. It's almost as though he's gleaned all the information he needs from this person and just moves on, whether or not they're ready for him to do that. It was a nice touch and signifies the businesslike way he conducts himself while on the job. The Gannon and Blaisdell characters are compared and contrasted throughout the film, including in several almost parallel scenes. In one, we see Gannon meet Lily, played by Dorothy Malone, and we see an attraction begin between them, followed by them eating a home-cooked meal at her house. Right after that, we see the courtship start between Blaisdell and Jessie, followed by him stopping by her house for her to cook him breakfast. Which leads me to another parallel. That breakfast scene comes right before Blaisdell is called out into the street by 3 cowboys, including Gannon's brother. Watching him prepare for a gunfight is shown to be a typical matter of business for him. He simply pushes back from the table, straps on his gun belt, and heads outside. Compare that with Gannon, who later in the film is preparing for a gunfight when the cowboys are headed for town, and he nervously waits in the sheriff's office, practicing his draw. The high noon comparison becomes pretty clear at that point, as he is outnumbered and all alone, and does want help, but only from anyone but Clay Blaisdell. It's during that section that Blaisdell asks Gannon to show him how fast or how well he can draw his gun. And Gannon does it, but Blaisdell doesn't say a word. His face barely moves. His appraisal of his skills is only implied, and it's a great moment between the two men. Anthony Quinn, as I mentioned, plays Tom Morgan, the Doc Holliday to Henry Fonda's Wyatt Earp style character. I found his performance pretty good in some scenes, and then a little overblown in some others. His and Henry Fonda's relationship is an interesting one, with them having bonded after Blaisdell just accepted him as he is years ago, not caring that he was a cripple. Obviously, this is in place of Doc Holliday's tuberculosis, showing their routine of coming into town, Blaisdell taking on a marshal's job while Morgan opens up shop as a saloon owner, was well done, and established these as characters who do this for a living. At least Blaisdell does. Morgan seems to live with a kind of hero worship of Blaisdell, wanting him to be seen as a hero, and Morgan always backing him up. He has some devious motivations that are interesting to figure out and watch as the machinations he is working at begin to crumble, but I just found his performance to be a little strange and stood out from the rest of the cast in a way that didn't quite fit. Dorothy Malone is not an actress I usually like very much, and I thought the same thing for the first while after she shows up, but she did grow on me as the movie went on. The whole time I was expecting a sinister twist with her character, which I won't say what happens, but she did keep me guessing. Dolores Michaels was good as the almost angelic character who Blaisdell falls in love with. Her character is one of several wedges driven between Blaisdell and Morgan. Because if Blaisdell marries Jessie, then he'll quit being a gunman, and then Morgan goes back to being a nobody, not the gunfighting friend to a celebrated marshal. Also in the cast is Wallace Ford as the town judge. Obviously he's playing a different character, but his presence reminded me of Wichita, another town tamer western, and that one actually about Wyatt Earp. Frank Gorshin plays Billy Gannon, Johnny's brother, and I thought he was a great choice. First of all, seeing the two acting opposite one another, you really get the feeling that they could be brothers in real life, with similar facial structures. But his performance as a young man trying to prove himself was really well drawn, and you can see his nervousness shining through every time he tries to get a little too brave. Richard Arlen, Whit Bissell, Don Beto, L.Q. Jones, Walter Coy, Don Redberry. The list of great Western character actors that show up here goes on and on. But another guy who was a real standout here was DeForest Kelley. He plays another one of the cowboys that Richard Widmark used to ride with, and he was just excellent. I've never thought he exactly fit in Westerns. He can't quite pull off the hats and costumes, but his performance was so good that it really doesn't matter. He starts off as quite the loudmouth, intimidating the shopkeepers of the town, But his friendship with Richard Widmark and watching his friend stand his ground against overwhelming odds starts to sway him, and the slow, subtle change in his character was really great to watch. The evil rancher at the center of the trouble is Tom Drake, playing Abe McEwen. If there was one role I didn't think was well cast, it would have to be this one. He just wasn't a very imposing bad guy. In a way it makes sense. Every time he challenges someone to a fight, he makes sure to have at least 2 or 3 men ready to backshoot his opponent, so he doesn't have to be a big scary guy if he's going to cheat. But I couldn't really understand why so many men would follow him. He's not a terribly inspiring leader. Getting back to the Earp connections, there is a stagecoach robbery that happens fairly early on that is an inciting incident for several major events later in the film. And there was also a stagecoach robbery in the real-life story that escalated the tensions between the Earps and the cowboys. Seeing Morgan's part in this one was a nice twist, though. It's mentioned a Big Ben Nicholson was killed by Clay Blaisdell in the last town he worked at, and he had a brother, Bob Nicholson. I'm not sure if that was meant as a reference to the real-life Ben and Billy Thompson, connected to Wyatt Earp in that he claimed to have arrested Ben Thompson after a killing, but it did seem quite coincidental. The movie's gunfight that I would call the equivalent to the gunfight at the OK Corral comes when Billy Gannon and 2 other cowboys ride in to take on Blaisdell and Morgan in the street. Richard Widmark's Johnny Gannon basically functions as Sheriff Behan, stopping Blaisdell and Morgan and convincing them to let him try and talk the cowboys out of fighting. He goes down and tries to prevent the violence that's coming, but is unsuccessful, just like Behan was. Speaking of that scene, Widmark has a great line when his brother asks if he'll help them, and he responds with, "I ain't backing him because you're my brother, and I ain't backing you because you're wrong." It's a perfect line, and Richard Widmark just nails it. After the gunfight, and it is an excellently staged gunfight, I believe Blaisdell tells the remaining unharmed cowboy, "Get shooting or get out of town." And what did Wyatt Earp tell Ike Clanton in the midst of the fighting? Get to fighting or get away. All of these little nuggets of familiarity were a lot of fun to pick up on, and putting them into a film that isn't explicitly the Wyatt Earp saga was almost better. So many movies have told that story to varying degrees of success. Henry Fonda did it himself in My Darling Clementine, that we all know the story, and you can tell when something isn't quite right. So if you just loosely retell it, you won't get all the historical accuracy purists jumping down your throat. Besides the gunfight I already described, the rest of the action in the film was also really strong. It's fairly sparse, and the threat of violence is used almost just as much as the actual guns blazing scenes, and it all builds excellent tension. Having the gunfights play out quickly was a good choice, I thought. Blaisdell is a professional, and he ends problems as quickly as they begin, with as few bullets used and men killed as possible. I like that this movie never portrays violence as a triumphant action or response. It's something that happens, but no one is all that happy about it. There was also a very well-staged fight when Gannon rides to McEwen's ranch to warn them not to come into town. He and McEwen have a really vicious fistfight, and it ends with Gannon getting a knife driven through his hand. The brutality of that whole scene was almost film noir-like, and reminded me of the scene in The Glass Key, when William Bendix beats Alan Ladd to a pulp. The scene in Warlock is nowhere near that intense. The Glass Key is on a whole other level. But it's that unyielding courage that Richard Widmark demonstrates in the face of pain and steep odds that pushes that character into the hero he's been contemplating becoming. The movie was shot in CinemaScope and quite a bit on location in various parts of Utah, and I love the scenery and landscapes. One scene where Henry Fonda is practicing with his gun on a cliff with the red rocks and a huge valley stretching out behind him looked amazing. I also really love the costumes. This movie was produced in the era when westerns weren't afraid to be colorful. That period of the 40s and through the 50s was great for that. The 60s had it to a degree, and John Wayne's films held on to it the longest probably, but after a certain point, muted colors and just varying shades of black and beige took over the Western genre. Again, that's fine if you really care about historical accuracy, and I do to a degree, but I love it when a Western has its cast decked out in a variety of looks. Henry Fonda and Anthony Quinn both get many well-tailored and great-looking suits and vests. Richard Widmark takes a break from the denim jacket for a few scenes, and the bad guys get a whole stable of interestingly colored costumes. The music was by Lee Harline, and to be honest, it didn't stand out to me very much, but there are a couple of moments towards the end where it comes in strong and builds tension really well. I have one issue with this movie, and without getting into the details too much, the Clay Blaisdell character takes a turn towards the end of the movie, after a pretty tragic event. Tom Morgan ends up following through with the trajectory that he looked to be on, so I understand the shift Blaisdell makes. So mainly, it's the tone of the movie at this point that I didn't care for. It becomes rather melodramatic, and a lot more of the movie was understated and was a slow burn. Again, the explosion of emotion makes sense from a character perspective, but I didn't like the shape it took, if that makes sense. The very ending of the movie I thought saved it, and wraps up this story with basically as close to a happy ending as we could expect after all the events that have transpired. Warlock is a very well-made Western filled with complex characters. A lot of the fun is after the movie has set them all up, watching them confront and bounce off of one another, and seeing these volatile characters interact was suspenseful and really enjoyable. It's a Western where the story and the characters come first, and I recommend it. Thanks for watching my review. If you enjoyed it, head on over to my channel, Hildebrand Productions, for more reviews. Adios for now.